We are very excited to have our speaker, Ms. Patricia Gruver, today. Patricia Gruver is a senior fellow at New America, and she also served as the Pacific Council on the International Policy Tech Diplomacy Fellow, and also co-founded the Tech Diplomacy Network. It is kind of the initiative that strives to define the nascent field of the tech diplomacy. She also leads science diplomacy programming for the National Science Policy Network, and previously worked as a science attaché for the governments of Quebec and UK. We are very happy to have her today. And without any further delay, I invite Ms. Patricia to share her knowledge with us. Thank you, Patricia. And
thanks, Raj, for the intro. And thanks, Lauren, for setting this up. It's really exciting to be able to, share some of my experience and knowledge with all of you. As Raj mentioned, I'm a former science attaché for the British and Quebec governments. And when I was with the British government, I was the communications lead for the entire US, UK Science and Innovation team. So we thought it'd be great to share some of these skills with all of you. So I'm going to share my screen. After the session, you should be able to communicate with high-level individuals in government, write a persuasive letter, write better emails, hopefully, and draft a concept note. So the reason, we pick some of these topics is because I lead the science diplomacy programming at NSPN, and these are some of the skills that are necessary to or that are part of the fellowship training and also the diplomatic skills training. I think hits on this a little bit in terms of like communication in diplomacy. Okay, so we are just going to jump straight into it. I'm going to ask all of you, we're going to set up breakout groups. You're going to need to maybe write this part down, although hopefully we'll be able to send this into each of the breakout sessions. We would like you to draft a speaking invitation to Jennifer Bacchus at the U.S. Department of State to speak at a symposium on global AI policy that NSPN is putting together on this specific date at this specific time in Washington, D.C. at the Omni Hotel. So things to think about when you're writing this letter are what will get her to say yes, or what will get her team to say yes, and her expertise. So this is, if you work in diplomacy or you work in government, you may be asked to send or to write letters to folks to get them to be part of your event. And so this is an exercise that would be used a lot if you worked in diplomacy. So Lauren is going to set up the breakout rooms, and then we'll jump around and visit them to see how everybody's going. This will take about 10 minutes, but if you want to copy this information down, and then, like I said, we'll also try to share it in the chat so that everybody has it as well. Well, I hope that helped you, kind of get warmed up for what, we're talking about tonight, and get you thinking about how to, include information about a speaker and an invitation or a request that, would go a long way in getting them interested. So I told one of the groups that this is actually an invitation I sent to Jennifer Bacchus's department, and I had to change some things because there's some proprietary information in there. But okay, so this is an actual letter that was sent to her office. So you want to, if you're going to write an invitation for a speaking engagement, especially for like high level individuals, it's best to send it as like an attachment rather than in an email. It just seems like more professional. You can put like the letterhead of your organization on top, and then you can put the office and the address. It's kind of old school, but I think sometimes it something like this goes, you know, the little extra mile to see that you're professional and serious about this invite. So, you know, you include information about the place, where it's going to be located, the time, if the event is going to be, you know, closed or open to a global audience. You also, you know, include information about what the technology policy symposium would be about. So, you know, I brought up the symposium is about global AI policy, an area where we believe the US could become a leader, giving your bureau's work on rallying like-minded and allied countries around global digital governance. We believe your perspective will be a great asset to our symposium. And, you know, I kind of gave a background as well on, you know, some of the challenges that are being faced in the digital sphere, and you know why specifically we decided to focus on digital policy for the symposium, for example. So this is again a real example of an invitation that was sent. So I'm going to go to the next slide. So something that you know, you should think about when writing an email is knowing your audience. So who you're speaking to. If you don't know them already, you need to go on LinkedIn or Google. And when you're reaching out to them, you want to bring up any relevant information during your communications with them. Like, oh, I saw, you know, I saw the live stream of your talk at New America last week, for example. So you also want to think about scheduling something, especially when you're thinking about, you know, diplomacy related work. Think about how you're formatting time. So when you're engaging with a British diplomat, if you ask to meet at 2, I mean, they'll probably get it because you're American, but it would be better to ask them to meet at 1400. And then just a useful tip is that UTC is commonly used amongst diplomats in the international community to schedule phone calls and Zoom. So get to know UTC as a time format. I think it's really useful to know where on the scale you are. Okay, so email communication. So if you're communicating with a staffer from a government agency, you will not need to be this formal, but you need to make sure that there's some context given for your request. Shorter is better, but you know, we should always be aware of our tone. We don't want to come across as blunt or abrasive in emailing someone. If you're sending a cold email, so you don't know them, you have no connections at all, or sorry, if you have a mutual connection, always point that out in the initial example. So, you know, I'm using Lauren as an example here. Lauren Wagner suggested I reach out to you, as we've both worked with Meridian International Center in the past. Using bullet points to highlight your request is really useful to get your point across. If the person doesn't respond within 1 week, follow up. If the person does not respond again in another week, follow up another week later. And after the 3rd attempt, you might just have to find a different route into the organization. And then these are just words that I think frequently come up in emails. I'm guilty of using them, but you know, words to avoid in emails, just, like, and only. Phrases to avoid: I was just wondering, sorry to bother you, if it's not too much trouble, just let me know, and I hope that's okay. And you know, there's other phrases that you can use here. So instead of saying sorry to bother you, you could instead try thank you for your time, consideration, or attention. Or you could simply omit this and get straight to your request. Instead of saying I was just wondering, you could say, what are your thoughts on X? Or I'm writing to see if Y. Instead of saying, does that make sense? Instead, say, please let me know if you have any questions, or please don't hesitate to reach out if you have any questions. And then finally, I know since a lot of folks here are probably interested in, you know, being science diplomats are getting into the space, don't be afraid to ask to do an informational interview. People love talking about themselves. And, if you're in DC, or even if you're not in DC, you could ask them to like do a coffee meeting for 30 minutes. Again, I think people are always happy to share their experiences. I wouldn't go like too high up the ranking in the beginning. Like, I wouldn't reach out to somebody like Jennifer Bacchus, but let's say you're interested in doing a AAAS fellowship. I think most AAAS fellows at state, for example, would probably be interested in having like an informational interview and telling you about their work, or how the AAAS interview process, or anything like that. So again, don't be afraid to reach out. Something to think about with communication is how status affects communication. So you want to make sure, if you're talking to somebody such as an ambassador, that you find the appropriate honorific. So honorifics are just what goes in front of their name. So ambassadors are His or Her Excellency, and elected or appointed government officials are the Honorable. So instead of saying Congressperson, whoever, you would say the Honorable. I'm trying to think of a congressperson, the Honorable Chuck Schumer or something. If you are invited to a meeting with a government official, this is a very specific example, but it's something that's come up a few times, that folks that have done the Science Diplomacy Fellowship, they need to be aware that if they go into a meeting with a government official and they cannot attend, you need to tell the meeting organizer that you're not coming, because it reflects upon you and maybe the organization that you're working for, if you kind of just ghost the person. And so in some other cultures, higher status is designated to those who have lived longer. And so you might want to keep this in mind when communicating with individuals from other countries. And again, this is something that has come up during the Science Diplomacy Fellowship, in which, folks might not be aware of the status or the higher status of someone designated because of their age. Building a professional network. So first off, I would start by leveraging your connections at NSPN. So as Lauren mentioned, if you're not a member, I would definitely look into it. We have a great network. We have a lot of great alumni who are now working at state, at USDA, at the Department of Commerce, at the Department of Energy. You think of a federal agency, they're working there. We also have alumni working for foreign governments and state and local governments as well. So if that's something you're interested in, I would definitely think about joining NSPN. And then, so if you're a member at NSPN, you can leverage the connection. So either your peers, staff, speakers at events, you can invite them to coffee if you're based in the same town or city. Or if you're just visiting the city where they're based, you could offer to take them out for coffee. And you can ask your contacts for introductions to others as well. Attend events in person if possible. Nothing can replace in-person interactions. Bring business cards, and a lot of folks in programs might not have business cards because you're still in school, but you can go to Staples and use your university logo and make up a business card, so that people have your contact information. And then something that's really important with building a professional network is to reconnect with old contacts as much as possible. Invite them to events that you're hosting, ask them to be stakeholders in a project you're working on, and connect them to others looking for their expertise, because you never know when they could end up being a very useful contact for you down the road, in terms of helping you put on an event, or even helping you get a job down the line. So try to maintain those contacts and keep those contacts warm. Okay, so the last exercise we're going to work on is a concept note. So a concept note, there's multiple uses for one. You can use it for a project proposal, a conference, or a workshop. They range from 2 to 3 pages, and they should include an introduction, a background, proposed objectives, and results. So we would like to work on drafting a concept note for a project that you'd like to do for or with the Science Diplomacy Committee. Sorry, my toddler just walked in the room. So this is the project description, and you would answer all of these questions. Sorry. Answer all of these questions to kind of build your concept note. And then, this final question is very important. So what is the relationship between this project and NSPN's wider mandate? But again, the reason we focused on the concept note is because this is something that comes up during the Science Diplomacy Fellowship that NSPN puts on as well. So this is why we decided to focus on this. So this is the exercise that we're going to work on, and we're going to do breakout groups again because we have a ton of time left. I'm going to stop sharing my screen for a minute. I can't see anybody. Lauren, should we break out in groups for like 20 minutes and have folks work on the concept note? At least get started on answering the questions, and then, if this is something that you would like to pursue, you could submit it to the Science Diplomacy Committee later.
Yeah, definitely. So 20 minutes, will return at 6:55 Eastern, 3:55 Pacific. And I think also, since we have folks from outside organizations here today, if you think of a project that your own organization can do, I think you can also gear your concept note towards your own organization's goals. So it doesn't have to be specifically for the Science Diplomacy Committee, but if you're a member of NSPN, we would love to hear your ideas and see what you can come up with.
So does anyone want to share their idea? Obviously 20 minutes is not a long time to actually write a concept note. Like if I were given this task, it would probably take me like 2 or 3 days to like have a final finished product. So we obviously don't expect anything, but if you'd like to share maybe an idea that you have for like the Science Diplomacy Committee or for your organization, or your thought process behind the concept note, we welcome that.
Yeah, we can share our thoughts, what we discussed and what we made, me and Carol and Alicia, we did. We were talking about PFAS chemical. So we create we brainstorm few ideas. I think Carol written down stuff, so if she wants to share, I can also talk.
Sure. Yeah, we decided to name it Moving Away from Forever Chemicals, The Dangers of PFAS. So for a little bit of background, PFAS is short for polyfluoroalkyl substances, and it's a class of about 12,000 chemicals found in products like food packaging and carpets that repel water, grease, and stains. They're linked to as carcinogens and have other health related effects. So what we decided to do is that create a project that seeks to create awareness of these dangerous chemicals and finding alternatives by working with scientists across fields. Additionally, our project would work with stakeholders as well. Our project will create awareness by different community outreaches, creating pamphlets, disseminating information for the communities. And our goal is for the community to use their awareness and eliminate the usage of PFAS considerably. This project could be monitored by obtaining marketing data from populations that we're targeting, as well as taking polls of the populations that we're targeting. and we could further advocate for different different stakeholders to use their voice as well in order to eliminate the usage of PFAS in the long term. So those are just some ideas that we had.
Great. So this is like an advocacy campaign then, like targeting the use of PFAS and okay. And so, sorry, did I miss the theory of change? Did you have like what was your kind of theory of change behind the project design? It's okay if you didn't, you know, get to that point.
That was
It's
kind of a
fine.
weird question, just because we kind of thought that there should have been a question that said, or like create your project design in between that. But so we kind of got lost a little bit in that.
No, it's fine. That's great though. Thank you for sharing.
Thank you, Carol. Thanks.
Does anyone else want to share their idea, concept, note, thought process, if you didn't get anything written down or anything? Okay, well, if you have like any ideas that you know that were specifically applicable to the Science Diplomacy Committee, you know, Lauren and I would welcome those. And Lauren, I don't know if you want to share your email in the chat in case somebody, you know, has an idea that they want to, you know, work on in a concept note and send over. And you know, if anyone has you know, a concept note that might not be related to science, the Science Diplomacy Committee of NSPN, but you know, you want someone to just get another pair of eyes, you can always send those to Lauren as well, and then she can send them to me to view those. But now I know we're kind of at time, but I'm happy to answer any questions you know, about this, or you know, email communication or written communication, persuasive writing, anything like that. I'm happy to answer any questions.
This may be an odd question, but how, if you do want to communicate with like a key policymaker on the Hill or something like that, like a lot of people have staffers. So how would you go about identifying a staffer, especially if you're not in DC?
Yeah, I would say identify the policymaker first, and then you can actually, for the most part, find their staffer, like their staffers listed on their webpage. I tend to reach out to the chief of staff first. If you want them to like do an event, for example, you can always like CC their scheduler, who, you know, oversees their entire calendar. That can be a good way to go. But, you know, the chief of staff will probably loop in the scheduler at some point too. You know, if they have like a specific policy person on the team that they can, you know, that you're maybe interested in, let's say defense policy or something, they might have like a defense policy staffer, and you can you know, look for who that is and reach out to that specific person instead of going to the chief of staff as well.
Okay.
There is a really great program called Leadership Connect, and I'm not affiliated with them in any way. But they like have the best kind of like Rolodex of everybody in DC. They're fantastic. Like you can just type in anyone's name and find their email and everything. I think it's kind of expensive, but I've worked for a number of organizations that use Leadership Connect, and it's really good.
I'll second that. I was able to use it during an internship that I did, and it was so easy to find people. And you can also see like people's employment history, like the roles they've had in the past. It's like LinkedIn, but like even more in depth, and you can see everyone's contact.
And you get updates when people switch jobs. So if like one staffer goes to work for another policymaker, or like somebody moves within like Department of Energy or something, it like shows up. You get like email notifications, so it's pretty good.
Patricia, do you remember like how much would it cost? Like, since you mentioned it's actually a little bit expensive.
Yeah, I would say like if you work for an organization, see if they have access to it. But I don't think it's probably like an individual.
I see.
It's probably very expensive. But you know, if you work for an organization, you could like tell them about it as a potential, you know, CRM. But yeah, it's a really great resource. But again, I think you can find most of this. You can find a lot of like the staffers on just the people, the policymakers' web pages too. Any other questions? Oh. Okay, so a question in the chat. Do you have any words of caution or topics to specifically avoid in communicating with high-level diplomats and policy advisors? So you never want to talk about elections or your hopes about the results of an election. You know, I worked for 2 foreign governments during the Trump administration. And so that can be difficult to not say anything, but it is important that when you're working for a government to kind of follow the government, you know, prescribed lines. You know, I wouldn't bring up certain sensitive topics. So for example, I was in you know, there was a quote in Politico or something about how the US Department of State tech envoy was still communicating with his Russian cyber partners. And, you know, we mentioned, like, is this something that we could ask about during a panel? And obviously that's a no-go. So, you know, you want to be really careful about, you know, potential things that you probably are not going to be given the answer to, basically. And yeah, I would say around elections, presidential, even like, you know, the congressional elections, I wouldn't ask questions about like, who do they want to win the US election, for example, in 2024. That's something that they will not give their opinion on, and they would feel very uncomfortable answering those questions. There was a thing that we used to have at the British government that we would call the Daily Mail test. They would say, don't do anything or say anything that would put you in the Daily Mail. And the Daily Mail is kind of like the New York Post equivalent. So yeah, you would just want to avoid saying anything that would have you end up, you know, in that newspaper. Any other questions? I think Lauren mentioned this, but I just wanted to mention it one more time. The applications for the Science Diplomacy Fellowship will be opening up at the end of November, and we have some great project hosts this year, Argentina, Chile, among others, and they're going to be working on topics like AI. So if this is something you're interested in, definitely apply. We'd love to see your application.
And I'll also just say a few words before we end today's workshop. First of all, thank you so much, Patricia, for sharing your expertise with us today. I've certainly learned a few things that I didn't know before. as well. And I really appreciate Raj's help, as well as our workshop coordinator at the Science Diplomacy Committee, for helping us put this together today. We do have some exciting events coming up that are kind of in progress. We are planning a Brazilian science diplomacy seminar to be held around the beginning of December, as well as a Science Diplomacy 101 event for the end of November. So more information about that will be on the NSPN events webpage, which I will drop a link to right now in case anyone wants to follow our events. The Science Diplomacy Committee also has monthly committee meetings. So if anyone on this call is interested in getting more involved with the committee, I highly recommend coming to those once a month. It's a great opportunity to learn what we're up to and to connect with other members of NSPN who are interested in a science diplomacy career and just learning more about science diplomacy in general. So our next committee meeting is going to be on November 30th at 7 p.m. Eastern, and that's also visible on the calendar if you become a member of NSPN. And with that, I think we can close out today's workshop. Thank you again, Patricia and Raj. Like Patricia said, you're welcome to send me drafts of your concept notes or connect for any other reason. If you want to talk about science diplomacy or pitch some ideas for the NSPN Science Diplomacy Committee to get involved in, my email is in the chat, so don't be a stranger.